Hi, welcome to the Center for Heterodox Economics at the University of Tulsa in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My name is Scott Carter. I'm professor of economics and chair of economics as well. I want to welcome you to Tulsa and welcome you to our March event at the Center for Heterodox Economics. This event's going to be dealing with housing, displacement. We have three wonderful scholars that are coming here. They came from New York City and they have a global reach. And with that, I'd like to pass this over to Clara Mattei, the director for the Center for Heterodox Economics, who can give you a better introduction.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's wonderful once more to see a full room of community members who want to delve into participating into creating an economics that actually speaks to people, but doesn't just speak. It is actually, hopefully, a tool to engage in more successful social transformation. And this is ultimately the spirit of the CHE, is how to think about knowledge in a way that is empowering rather than disempowering, given that how dominant economics, so-called orthodox economics, understands its role is very much about keeping the decision-making power in the hands of the very, very few. So the possibility of saying we actually want to transform the very locus through which economics is not only thought about, but also in a way brought to people is really, really important. It's not a top-down approach. We are trying to create a space in which actually we as academics can also learn from those that are not in academia, but actually know a lot more about economics, unsurprisingly, because they actually live the economic world. And guess what? Economics is not about numbers, it's about people, even if this is rarely mentioned. So ultimately, you guys can really help shape the discussion and the type of theory that can be useful to think about real questions. And real questions, for example, like the one that we are addressing today, the question of housing crisis, a question that I think really embodies the full scope of the contradictions of our capitalist economic system. Indeed, the very fact that more than half of the homeless population in the United States works, just can't not actually make enough money to afford a roof on their heads, while we have the billionaires enrich themselves by 5.7 billion a day. This is the new statistics from Oxfam. This gives you a sense of the great polarization that is accelerating in a capitalist society, but this polarization ultimately really is expressed in the fact that housing has become a commodity. And again, it responds to the logic of profit rather than the logic of need. And there's no one better here than to discuss the issues than our panelists who are have the rare capacity in academia to connect social struggles with theoretical foundations. And trust me, it's not easy to find these types of scholars around. And this is why ultimately we, as a center, are trying really to bring to you people who are thinking revolutionarily about theory. And when I say revolutionary, I really mean in a way that subverts not only just the type of theory that is proposed, but the type of method through which you even start theorizing about economic issues. So here we are today. I'm going to present the panelists one at a time so that you can focus on one bio rather than three. And I will start with Miguel. Miguel is actually professor of urban studies at the New School and Parsons. Miguel has an incredible expertise as urbanist, theorist, designer, educator, and podcaster, recognized for his transdisciplinary anti-capitalist approach to urbanization. His work integrates Marxian political economy, urban political ecology, critical human geography, and progressive urban policy to challenge capitalist urbanization and advance social spatial justice. You'll tell us more what those terms mean. In 2008, he co-founded Cohabitation Strategies, a nonprofit cooperative dedicated to social spatial development and countering neoliberal urbanization. In 2019, he co-founded Urban Front, an international consultancy that collaborates with progressive governments around the world, including the Mexican government right now, and we'll hear more about that, for the right to the city. Additionally, alongside Marxian geographer David Harvey, he co-founded Politics in Motion, a media platform addressing capitalist urban contradictions and envisioning alternative future. Miguel teaches regularly with David Harvey. David could not join us also because of health reasons, but they really collaborate closely in teaching students both at the grad center in New York and at the New School to think holistically about the issues of housing and more broadly our economy. So Miguel, the floor is yours. Miguel is going to focus mostly on the causes to then pass to the consequences and solution, but then we will have, the plan is to have 10 minutes each, first round, then kind of a second round of exchange of ideas, and then we open it to the floor, so we'll have more than enough time to get the conversation going in a more circular way. Please, Miguel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. It's really great to see, such a big turnout. It's always very difficult to what to expect, when we're talking about these issues. But without doubt, the question of housing is really one of the most pressing things because it affects our daily lives completely. My role in this first sort of round will be to talk a little bit of the historical aspects of what has led us into this point. And we believe that understanding, the historical processes is a very, very important way to understand how to address it, right? Because it's not something that just happened because it just happened. It has a whole sort of history behind it. And I'm not going to go back centuries, but certainly at least to the middle of the century to explain this. I also, for the aspect of being much more, precise, normally I tend to totally improvise these things, but I wrote a kind of a script that I'm going to follow with a flexible way. So if you see me going down here to this machine and so on, don't be, but I'm just going to try to flow it. And Clara just asked for 10 minutes. I think it's going to be a little more, but I think it really was going to set the stage, right, for all the conversations that we're going to have. I hope, because I wrote the script in that sense, in that relationship. And the first thing that I believe is very important to mention, and I don't need to tell you this, is that, of course, we are living through transformation that is as insidious as it is visible, right? And that is a kind of I call it like a systemic mutation. And that systemic mutation is much better represented in our urban landscapes, right? It's our everyday life. And then this is where precisely housing has become, and we really see it like this, as a key battleground in the struggle between capital and us, people, right? Today's housing crisis is not, I think, a temporary disruption or a failure of governance or government. The way that I see it, it is the absolute logical outcome of a very long historical arc of capitalist development. And I believe that this crisis must be understood almost like as a manifestation of the contradictions that are internal to this sort of capitalist system. And what we face right now is not just the unaffordability of housing. I believe it's much more extreme. It is actually the collapse of the liberal democratic promise that they once said. They claimed that they would balance capitalist accumulation with social welfare. And I think the majority of us are completely disillusioned by that frame. And with that said, our disillusion, what we're seeing is that it's being replaced by a convergence of what we talk about neoliberal, which when we meet about neoliberal or neoliberalism is a period of time that started pretty much with Ronald Reagan that focused on the privatization of most state public assets. And of course, in more accumulation of wealth. And of course, in the creation of billionaires, which, by the way, did not exist before that period, right? So we've been undergoing a process of, 40, 50 years, right, of this thing. And that convergence of neoliberalism and the austerity that it has gone with global real estate speculation, and of course, this convergence has created some kind of an authoritarian political form. And this is precisely what I define today as what neo-fascism is, the convergence of neoliberal ethos with all of those kind of international global speculative markets. So I see this as not a rupture of neoliberalism, of this 50-year period that I'm talking about, but actually an adaptation of this authoritarian, or towards an authoritarian regime, that the reason that we have this is because it needs this authoritarianism, to maintain its rule. Otherwise, we would not continue this because it's going crazy and we don't understand what's happening. And with that, authoritarianism is, I think, neutralizing dissent, scapegoating, of course, the most vulnerable in our population, and militarizing urban governance. So it is precisely in the space of housing that this convergence is most actually felt. Urban environments, at some point, they were imagined as these collective projects. And they have been hollowed out completely and repurposed as investment vehicles, exactly what Clara was just saying, for global capital. I mean, like we have evictions, homelessness, racialized displacements, and all of these things are not aberrations of the system, but I see them as an outcome, as a necessary outcome, actually, of financialized urban development. And as disillusionment grows, the far right steps in, because there's no other alternative so far, offering authoritarian answers to the democratic void that neoliberalism helped to create. So to grasp this transformation, I think, well, this is what I've been trying to do, is that at some point we have to reject this liberal reformism or liberal form of, I guess, governance that led us here, because ultimately what was on the back was precisely what turned out to be what we have now, right? And instead, I always believe that adopting a more like historical reference or historical understanding. Of course, Marx has been a very important guide to me. And again, for those of you that might be scared by this word, I really encourage you to just read one of his books and you will be very surprised, because it's not what the US government told you that it is. It's just basically a very thorough analysis of capital. That's it. And this is why it was so scary for capitalists, right? Because it was like already like showing everything that was behind their things. So with the housing question, what Marxism has taught me is that it has taught me to identify class relations, or the relations between class that are embedded in our urban space, in our neighborhoods. And it also, as I just said, exposes the mechanisms by which capital actually reproduces itself, precisely by destroying our social relations. And so this is what I've been working on a lot. Now, my task now is to trace a little bit this convergence, which is historical and politically, and not so much to analyze, and I don't want to show you kind of like an analysis, but is so to make us think or to illuminate some kind of path towards the abolition of what has actually led us to this point. So to understand the current housing catastrophe, because it is that, it is an entanglement today of neo-fascist politics. We have to situate these in the roots, I think, of somehow post-war, right? Which is the first sort of moment of urbanization, of real urbanization that happened in the United States in terms of all kinds of developments, that went into it. And let's not forget that the type of urbanization that happened there was just prioritizing a specific sort of inhabitant of this territory, right? The first lines of housing that were made for people after the Second World War were very discriminatory. And it did not include those that did not, basically overall white population, and then disregarded completely Black populations and other kinds of immigrant populations that were around. And so in this period, we could still see, even though with all of this backbone of like it was not an ideal form of welfare, but governments around the world were trying to convince us that the kind of welfare that was the right way. No? And so you could see a lot of countries building social housing, building affordable housing. It's not only in the United States. The United States actually delayed a lot of it, but many, many places around the world. And somehow we tended to believe that that was the social contract. I mean, we work our asses off. I mean, for some, I guess, salary, but at least we can afford a nicer place to live, right? And a lot of people agree with that. I mean, basically most societies on this. So the governments at that period were kind of partially, I guess, taking out of the market a lot of the housing structures, right? They had the power, the man, so say, okay, we're gonna give that welfare amongst, of course, health and all the other things that most Americans have been losing gradually, you know, all of these rights. But at that period, that was the discussion. And so those investments on large housing, you know, I guess large-scale housing areas and publics, you know, were somehow an imaginary that still is being used today to create a kind of an alternative outlook. So most people that I know in politics have a certain direction towards bringing back that welfare period. You know? Because, of course, we all need housing. As a matter of fact, I'm with you, sir. I don't own a house. I mean, it's impossible. And then I don't know when and if I ever will be able to. I've been renting all my life, right? And so, but what I want to get very clear is that this, I guess, welfare arrangement was just an amelioration, for all the things that were happening behind, you know, capitalist doors, which was a continuous accumulation of capital that needed much more places to invest on. You know, one of the things that is very important to understand about capital is that it continually expands because it needs to find new markets and new places where to put the money that everybody's making. And this continues, right? This is a process that has continued since a long time ago, since capital became more or less the dominant form of social relationships. And in that kind of situation where capital is accumulating and capitalists needed new markets, of course, any form of amelioration from a welfare position is not, you know, it's not common sense, at least for a capitalist, right? Because, of course, that is an opportunity for expanding and for having profit, more profit and more profit. So since that period, what we have actually seen is a slow realization of capitalism and capitalist governments and investors that all of that welfare that we all had at some point, not we all, because many places around the world didn't have it either, but that some actually had the privilege of, or because that's how it's seen by capital governments, it was just slowly eroded. And it was slowly being taken away, right? And all being privatized. So let me give you one big example. I mean, the United States creating Section 8, you know, well, it's a very important part. Section 8 works because it's a private, right, enterprise. I mean, the government subsidizes the rest that the tenant is not paying and subsidizes it to give it to the landlord, which is a private landlord, right? A lot of the issues on Section 8 public housing arise out of that, you know, that people just buy this housing or like I get a concession from the government to have it, and then they can make as much profit as any market rate because the government is paying them the extra difference that the person is paying for as a tenant. And so you could see that many of these housing agendas started to become slowly and slowly eroded until we have gotten to the point that we are today. I mean, the point that we are today is that the majority, if not all, of housing stock, right, has become in some form privatized. Even to the level, like in New York City, you know, we say that we have public housing that is owned by the New York Housing Authority. And even that is serviced by private organizations, so by what some of you were saying, by the nonprofit kind of real estate, agenda, which is something that I think we're going to be problematizing a lot in our discussion today. And so once that has been turned out or turned towards the private market, we started to have a lot of problems. And one of those many problems that arise, if you remember the 2007-2008 financial crisis, right? If you remember that it was out of mortgages, right? Perhaps some of you actually suffer the consequences of this. Financial crisis was something that had to do with banks were lending money that were not supposed to lend. And people believed that they could have a decent house and with a credit that they were not able to pay, and the banks knew this, right? That sort of crisis generated what I was talking to Clara earlier on, that part of housing, which is perhaps our biggest problem today, that it has become enter the world of finance. And what I mean by entering the world of finance is that a house before these periods used to have only a value. If you were a landlord, you own a property, but that property did not make any money to you because you needed to rent it, right? Or you needed to sell it. So it is very common, like if you had empty properties, you will try as much as possible to rent this property. No? And what is happening, or what happened after that period, was an acceleration of using houses, private houses, as assets for being financialized on. So one of the rules that happened during the 2007-2008 financial crisis is that the government started to require banks to have more liquid capital or more assets to guarantee their loans. And so normally it's 20%, they have to guarantee that they have at least 20% of what they're lending. And so it was very easy for a lot of banking institutions to say, okay, we don't need to also have liquid assets, but we are allowed also to use your houses as part of that collateral, right? And so that moment is crucial because that means, first of all, if a bank is lending money in relationship to your house, it means that your house can never get cheaper, right? Because otherwise the bank starts to lose a lot. No? Another thing is that if that starts to happen, other banks start to acquire housing, more housing, because they use it as a collateral. Then private investment firms came after the 2008 financial crisis. We're talking about Blackstone, which is right now one of the largest in the United States, but certainly the largest in the world, that started to buy houses of the people that had lost their house to the cheaps, right? Banks were just giving them to them, and they started deciding to make a business out of just renting. There's been a major shift also during your lifetimes, where most of us now only talk about the capacity to rent. No, there's like a complete inversion of what, the American dream, I guess it used to be, that you could own your own property, your own house. Whatever critique we can have to that, American dream situation. But the issue with financialization, and this is, I think, what I want to put on very clearly to you guys, is that people or banks or capitalists are making more money out of an empty property than of a property being rented to you, right? And how is that done? Through investment portfolios, right? And this is something that is a bit difficult to understand because we see a house as something that's difficult to trade upon and so on. For us, yes. My mother has been trying to sell her house for 4 or 5 years. She hasn't been able to, right? Because nobody wants it. But any capitalist banker or investor, the moment it acquires a house, it becomes an asset and can get money instantly, like a liquid capital, out of that portfolio of houses that they own. And so that means that not only the housing prices don't actually go down, right? But it also means that they don't care to house you. There's no need to house you. Actually, we're entering into a space where, cities can be empty and still make a huge buck for this population. And of course, we know that this is a bubble that is emerging, right? And this is a bubble that could go on forever. The prices of homes can continue to go on forever. We don't think that's going to happen, but the situation that I'm trying to put forward as a backdrop to everything that we're going to be discussing now is, of course, also how does these financialized properties are now being taken in the new stages of the United States government, right, which is the current administration. To put it in perspective, one of the biggest donors of the Trump administration is the Schwartzman, which is the owner of, or the CEO, but literally the owner of Blackstone, which is one of these corporations, right? And so the way that we analyze it, we see it as not only a perpetuation of these asset managements taking over our houses and not allowing the price to decrease, but also the possibility to even utilize government force to push for more privatization or dispossession so that these companies are the ones that end up managing these homes. And I will end up this with one thing that Clara mentioned. Traditional economics, and actually, if you go into any news channel, whether it's Fox News, Newsmax, or MSNBC, or any of them, when they talk about housing, or the newspaper, New York Times, or whatever, they say that the problem that we don't have, housing is because there's not enough supply. I'm sure you've all heard this, right? And so what do? We go and go to people in the state or in the municipality and start to demand, for much more supply. There's a thing between YIMBYs, the yes in my backyard people and not in my backyard people. In many of, in my view at least, these are kind of been manipulated a lot because, of course, what real estate development wants is to build more houses, more homes, right? And in New York City, we have a surplus or like an excess of homes that are luxury housing. Like if you're a millionaire there, you have the biggest shopping mall of housing, units that you can have. And the majority are empty, right? And they could continue to build more and more and more housing, but they don't need, again, as I was saying, to house you in these things, right? So the process in which right now we're dealing with is not a matter of supply and demand. And this is where I take on the classical economy or classical economist. This is more of an issue, first of all, of taking our homes out of the financial game. And that not only means taking our homes, or demanding that there are laws that prohibit, venture capitalists to buy them, right? But also that by doing that, start to speculate on the possibility that we limit the equity of our properties. Because that is also, the secondary issue when we're talking about capital accumulation or the amount of money that wealth creation it is. The majority of people, perhaps you don't, but they see their homes as an investment, right? They see it as the possibility of having a retirement. Why? Because you always are speculating on your property without you perhaps understanding what's going on. Your wish is that your house will continue to go up and up and up, which, by the way, is completely unsustainable and unrealizable, but this is what is happening now. And so the two things that I want to sort of move towards my colleagues there to continue to expand are these two things. Perhaps one of the many things we have to do and to fight within the housing space is get it out of the finance and also fighting the speculative factor of our homes over this. And I will, thank you, Clara. This is an intro.
Thank you, Miguel. Yeah, I think the New York, as the wealthiest city in the world, really encapsulates well the contradictions that you're explaining. There are at least 60,000 vacant apartments in New York, and there are more than 144,000 children who experience homelessness in 2024. This is 1 out of 8 of children enrolled in the public school district. So this is really where you see how the narrow focus of demand and supply that tells you that ultimately the markets are efficient. It's just about being able to feed the market and incentivize the entrepreneurs into what they excel at doing, as if there is no conflict, there's only a harmony, and we can all gain by letting the market be, by eliminating, right, the impediments for further investment, is a completely ideological view of things, because actually the market is antisocial. I mean, what you brought up, I think, is very important, is that actually we shape our behavior according to rules that are antisocial. And this because the market ultimately is the expression of the logic of profit, and this logic of profit is something that is very alien to human necessities. So I think this can really have us think why we really do need to go beyond what we hear on the media that, again, is inspired by very narrow economic approaches. And with Rob Robinson, I think this is exactly what we can do. Rob Robinson has an incredibly interesting profile. He also teaches at the Graduate Center and at the New School. Rob has a experience himself of homelessness for over 2 years. He'll tell us more about that in Miami. I'm going to read you, though, his full bio. Rob Robinson is a co-founder and member of the leadership committee of the Take Back the Land movement, and is currently a senior advisor at Partners for Dignity and Rights. After losing his job in 2001, he spent 2 years homeless on the streets of Miami and 10 months in New York City shelter. He eventually overcame homelessness and has been in the housing movement based in New York City since 2007. In the fall of 2009, Rob was chosen to be the New York City chairperson for the first ever official mission to the U.S. of a UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. He was a member of an advanced team coordinated by the U.S. Human Rights Network in early 2010. Rob has worked with homeless populations in Budapest, Berlin, and is connected with housing and land movements in South Africa and Brazil. He has worked with the European Squatters Collective, International Alliance of Inhabitants, the Landless Worker Movements, and movement of the people affected by dams in Brazil, and the platform of people affected by mortgages in Spain. He currently serves as the coordinator of the USA-Canada Alliance of Inhabitants on behalf of International Alliance of Inhabitants. Rob has also won multiple awards. The latest one, he will tell you the name because I keep forgetting, but it's a very prestigious one. But it's all day I've been trying to learn.
So thank you so much, Clara. Thank you. So the name of the award is the Lorraine Brown Tenant Organizing Award. It was bestowed upon me by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which is one of the most prestigious national groups doing advocacy work on behalf of tenants across the country. So it was an honor. And Lorraine Brown is a 92-year-old board member of that organization. To receive it from somebody like her in the inaugural award was really something special. So I'm appreciative of that award. And thank you for mentioning it. I want to thank everybody here at the University of Tulsa, particularly Clara and Scott, for inviting us. I can tell you I never expected to be on stages like this during the time that I was homeless or even before, right? But you never know where your life is going to take you. So I'm going to talk to you in 3 parts. I'm going to talk to you about a personal transformation, escaping homelessness, coming into organizing advocacy work, and then the state of homelessness, not only in New York City, but across the country, because it is a problem. So as you heard from my bio, I spent 2.5 years on the streets of Miami, homeless, and 10 months in the New York City homeless shelter. During those 2.5 years, I survived 3 hurricanes on the streets of Miami: Rita, Katrina, and Wilma. I was on the streets for all 3 of those hurricanes, and I'm here to talk about it today. So I sort of walked away from those experiences saying, there's something about this work that is pulling me. I did data technology work before that. I worked for automatic data processing, ADP, the payroll company before I went homeless, and I worked in IT. So I could have easily gone back to IT and done the work that I was doing before and probably made a lot more money, especially a lot more than I'm making now. But I don't know if I would be as happy as I am now, because the work that I'm doing now is fulfilling, and I think that's the big difference. So going through that experience transformed me. And what do I mean by that? It made me look at the world different. So as people coming up in the world, you're instilled with a certain set of values and principles and a certain set of experiences. And then you have lived experiences with your family, and you have experiences that you engage with from your education process. Then you're out into the world, and the world plays out a lot differently than it was explained to you. At least that's the way I interpreted what I went through. So I call it the transformation of Rob Robinson. When I came out of homelessness, I said, I got to dump my brain and learn the world all over again. And that was very detailed. The way I went about that, it was engaging with members of academia, because I came up with a theory. As I went through homelessness, that theory was this: gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. It seemed that there was a predetermined path for some people in this world, and most of those people look like me. So it's a question of what is happening here. So it took education, meeting with academia to try to understand, having books pushed in front of me and being told, read this and come back and let's talk about it. Miguel knows me very well, but one of my mentors in that work was a gentleman by the name of Neil Smith, a distinguished professor of anthropology and geography at the City University of New York Graduate Center, and heard me make that statement back in 2008. And I make the argument today that that forever changed my life, because Neil brought me in to lecture his PhD students. And for a bit of humor, I always say, I used to say to Neil, I can't lecture PhD students. I have an undergraduate degree. And Neil put his grill against mine and said, you taught me, you're going to teach my students. And I don't want to go into detail, but it led to me teaching a lot of his students and lecturing his students who teach now around the country, and bring me into their classes to lecture. But as you move forward, that I think that trade, or that theory that I came up with, started to help me to understand the world better. And something that Miguel touched on really is what drove me, and that was that financial crisis of 2008. There was something that was painful about that for me, that said, okay, Obama, the first African-American president, took our tax money to bail out banks, sending a strong message to us that you can fail, but the banks can't fail. And then once those banks got our tax money, they started foreclosing and evicting us in record numbers, right? And there's a process of home ownership in this country. So you guys are up against it, and I don't want to be negative here, but I'm going to be real, right? So they got those houses. They also got paid off from an insurance policy, because we had to buy it to guarantee that we could pay off the mortgage. And they still had the house. And they put it back on the market again. That's ridiculous. So in the work of Take Back the Land, it was a movement that African-American folks across the country came together and said, you can't have the money, the tax money in the houses too. So we're going to take back those houses and defend the rights of people, move the families back in there that were evicted, and defend their rights to stay in those houses using international human rights law, right? Couldn't get it to scale, but we were victorious in Rochester, New York, with a particular house that still stands today. That woman was given back her house after Bank of America took it from her and said, you could have it back for $50,000. But we got it in November 2014 for $1, right? And Catherine Lennon, thank you. Catherine Lennon lives in that house today with her 11 family members, happily ever after. But it's processes like that that has led to the increase in homelessness in this country, and particularly in New York. And the reason why I'm sort of picking on my own city is because, as you heard, it's the wealthiest city in the country, right? But, we take our money sometimes and we pour it into a hole, for lack of a better way to say it. So what do I mean by that? If I told you New York had 600 shelters, a lot of people would smile and say, that's great. You have plenty of places for homeless people to go. Those 600 shelters are supported by a budget of $3 billion a year. So we spend in New York City $3 billion to temporarily house people in shelters. Makes no sense, people. It makes no sense. And the city hasn't gotten at the root cause of the issue. And I don't think this country has gotten at the root cause of what the homeless problem is. Poverty is something that was never addressed in this city, and in this country. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X both took bullets going to the UN in Geneva to address the issue of poverty, right? Never been addressed. And then another fundamental cause, wages don't rise as fast as the cost of housing, right? It's an impossibility. But at the same time, we're being spoon-fed narratives that home ownership is the way to wealth. I think sometimes those narratives, we absorb them, and it makes me ask a question. I don't want anybody to get offended. How complicit are we in our own problems if we absorb those narratives without looking deeper into it, right? I don't think anybody, even when conditions were different 50, 60 years ago, when my family moved from Brooklyn, New York to Long Island, and my family bought a house for $22,500. Imagine that, $22,500. Right? Those conditions don't exist today. And it's not gonna lead to wealth. It may have back then led to some security that allowed you to send your child to a university because you built some equity, but it didn't really lead to wealth. The only ones that were getting wealthy were people who had plenty of money to buy plenty of houses and flip them and constantly sell it over. And so it was the same oligarchs that Miguel was talking about that are now private equity firms doing the same types of things. So you come to a situation now, and I want to step back a little bit to New York City. And one of the reasons why we have those 600 shelters is because of a law that exists in New York City called the Right to Shelter Law. That law clearly states on any given night, if a person goes to the city and demands a bed, the city has an obligation to give them a bed on any given night. It's different than a right to home, right? Or a right to housing. So I think there was a lot of, and myself, I'm a big believer in human rights. I don't believe in a right to shelter. I believe in a right to a home, and I think they look very different. By the same token, I think we have to understand that what is happening outside of the US may move us closer to this idea of a human right to a home. And this is why I engage in some of these struggles around the globe, because I see movements achieving better things. So for instance, I look at constitutions in progressive countries of the world. South Africa, post-apartheid, has a constitution written in 1996, clearly states housing is a human right in that constitution. Doesn't necessarily mean you actualize it, but you have an argument going into constitutional court, which is the equivalent of our Supreme Court. Brazil's constitution, post-dictatorship, and I spend a lot of time, I love this country, because the Constitution says land has to serve a social purpose or function. Has to be growing food or housing people, folks. What a unique phenomenon, right? Not like here, it's a property rights, individual owners, right? So it looks very different. The MST, the Landless Workers Movement, over the years has reappropriated land, taken it back from wealthy land barons and from the government, reappropriated land for 600,000 families. That's incredible. Families find a way to self-sustain. They have a piece of land that's fertile, can grow food, can build a house. It looks a lot different than the society that we live in. So coming back, if you don't have these protections of a constitution, ours is written 250 years ago, again, and I just have to throw this in because it just irritates me the more I hear it. We the people is the first line of our Constitution. Who were those people when people that looked like me were considered 3/5 of a man? Women didn't count. So who were those people? A few select group? It's something we should think about. On top of that, our civil law is based on that flawed Constitution. I don't know if I can support our civil law. I don't have any arguments for anybody. I don't want to cast any aspersions on anybody that fought for civil rights in this country. They were doing what they thought was right at the time. I'm a believer in human rights over civil rights. And I don't call myself a human rights defender. I call myself a human rights enforcer. Those rights exist, and I'm going to enforce those rights. So I'll give you some statistical data on homelessness, and then I'm going to pass it on because I think we need solutions to figure some things out, because one of the things we haven't done in this country is get at the root cause of homelessness. We constantly point out fingers and say, you failed. Anybody can make it in this country. And that was the very narrative that brought me into advocacy work, right? You know, when I came out of shelter, I would hear stuff like, well, you only in shelter for 10 months? And I'm like, okay, well, that's 9 months too long. It should be an emergency situation. But I know in New York City, the average length of stay in a shelter, 2 years. So shelter has replaced a home, right? And then there were these prevailing narratives, much like home ownership leads to wealth. There's narratives around homelessness. You're homeless because you don't want to work. You're homeless because you don't have an education. You're homeless because you have a chemical or an alcohol addiction. You're homeless because you have mental illness. Well, I went homeless. I started working when I was 9 years old with my dad, who was a chef in a restaurant, became a restaurant owner. So I'm not lazy. I want to work. I have a college degree. I injured my leg playing football at the University of Maryland, where I had a scholarship to play football. I have an undergraduate degree from the University of Maryland. I never diagnosed with a chemical or alcohol addiction. Don't have that problem. And certainly wasn't diagnosed with a mental illness. And I don't think that's a reason for us to discard society. It should be a reason that we embrace society and try to lift them up, right? So those prevailing narratives are something we have to push back on, right? And that's what drove me into this work. Couple that with the financial crisis of 2008, you get somebody who's boiling inside and says, I got to do something. I got to do my part. And the important thing for me was to find other voices like me who are willing to speak out. We do a great job of shaming people into submission and into corners in this country around the issue of homelessness. You failed, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Anybody can make it here. It's a line of bullshit, right? Because if obstacles are constantly thrown in front of me, I can't make it. I'm going to constantly keep falling on my face. So that has led us to a situation in this country where we have a count nationwide of about 770,000 people who are homeless. It's a flawed count. In New York, it's somewhere close to 5,000 people. And that number comes from a flawed count that is done by Housing and Urban Development every year called the Hope Count. I think in many cities it's flawed. It could be valid in some cities, but in my city, it's done the last Monday in January or the first Monday in February, Monday or Tuesday in February, some of the coldest days of the year. And the formula says we go out between 12 midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning and interview everybody who's on the street, and we come to a determination based on a calculation from the University of Pennsylvania and some data scientist named Dennis Colhane, who I love to get on a Zoom and debate because he freaks out every time he sees my face because I do challenge him. But it just says we're not getting at the root cause of the problem. You're homeless because you don't have a home, folks. So how do we move from a right to shelter to a right to a home, right? And start to understand that we need to find ways to decommodify land and housing. And I don't want to step into the conversation that Gabriella is going to deliver to you, but I'll leave it at that. When I came out of shelter, not so sure I knew what it meant, but I used to bang tables and try to get anybody who would listen say, we need to decommodify land and decommodify housing. It was the start of me understanding the capitalist society that we live in. And thank God I ran into professors like Miguel and people like Gabriella and the David Harveys in the world who just surrounded me with knowledge and said, read this, come back and let's talk about it. And here I am today letting you know how I feel about the situation. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob. That was very important. Again, because economists tend to rely often blindly on statistics. And the point is, how do you collect that statistic in the first place? Really, really matters. And the undercount of the homeless population, again, is another way to invisibilize the problem. I think one thing that maybe you can just specify, because I don't think you mentioned it, is why is it that there's such an interest in maintaining the shelter system? Who is gaining from it? And I think this is interesting because it has us question the non-profit kind of, in the complex. So if you could say a couple words about that.
About 90% of those 600 shelters that I mentioned are run by, quote, not-for-profit organizations. And the more people like myself speak out about it, the more I'm met with, Rob, you benefited from the shelter system. Why are you speaking out against it? I'm speaking out against it because I was inside. I understand how they were constructed, and I need to deconstruct it. But they always seem that I'm attacking their livelihood, right? And some of these folks make some high salaries. You'd be surprised the salaries some of these administrative folks make in these not-for-profit organizations. But the one thing I always make known to these folks, I never once said we don't need social workers. We just need them in a different setting than they appear in New York, right? That has to change. We have to think outside of the box. And I'll just add a little anecdote. So in 2018, a London School of Economics professor and a PhD student reached out to me to be a research assistant because they were comparing studies of homelessness in New York in the 90s and London in the 90s. And I used to have to make repeated trips to what we call the municipal archives. Information in New York is stored in an archive that you have access to. You can go in on a regular basis and pull information. And as I'm doing this research, I'm saying to myself, New York is doing the same thing today that it did 40 years ago, and it's expecting a different result. I was always told that's the definition of insanity, right? I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. This is really, really inspiring in pointing out all of the real problems. Finally, we have Gabriella with us, Gabriella Rendón, who's also a professor of urban planning at the New School and Parsons. Gabriella is Mexican-born, urban planner, researcher, author, and educator based in New York City. She's associate professor of urban planning and community development at the founding director of the Parsons Housing Justice Lab at the New School. At the lab, she leads the Housing Justice Oral History Project, which intersects oral history, critical cartography, community organizing, and advocacy. Rendon's expertise and research interests include community and spatial planning, housing and urban policy, social spatial restructuring, revitalization of immigrant neighborhoods, rise and settlement of Latinx urban communities, housing and tenants' rights, gentrification and displacement, cooperative housing models, as well as other collective and non-speculative housing development schemes, providing equitable development in profit-driven urban environments. She currently directs the MS in Design and Urban Ecologies and co-coordinates the graduate minor in Design and Urban Justice. She has a very long bio, but I think she's also written many books, including Cohabitation Strategies, Vision, and Actions for the Co-Production of Social Space. She's currently working on 2 books, Defiant Neighborhoods, Rise, Revitalization, Gentrification of Immigrant Communities in Latinx Brooklyn, and Grutier Handbook of Housing Justice. So, Gabriella, I think with you, it would be really nice to circle to, okay, so given that, as Miguel was pointing out, having a nostalgic view of the government's taking over with a welfarist plan is quite utopic, and also, by the way, very anachronistic and also incapable of seeing the limits of the welfare period in the 50s and 60s in this country. Actually, I'm currently working on a research exactly on that. So instead of kind of passively trying to hope for some form of reformist, enlightened reformist government, there is a lot that is happening on the ground. There is a lot of struggle that is already taking place with ideas to even overcome exactly the dream of just being a small property owner, because again, we've seen how the small property owner always loses, and once more, only can try to want to imitate what is ultimately the predatory speculation of the large asset managers. So how can we think about reorganizing housing, the struggle, and ultimately how does this make us more imaginative also in terms of collective participation and transforming our life in a more communal and ecological direction? Gabriella has a lot of expertise and she has a lot of different struggles that she participates in. And so we would love to hear a little bit about the alternatives.
Thank you, Clara and Scott, for inviting me to chair. It is an honor being here. And yeah, so my task was the easiest, like talking about solutions. And first of all, I work together with Miguel. We have Urban Front, that is like a consultancy. And we work also for many years on the ground with working very close with communities in this other cooperative that we have that was called Cohabitation Strategies. Now we work with progressive governments, and they ask us constantly, what are the solutions? And our response is always, there is not only one, there are many, depending of the social welfare, in the different countries. But I want to focus on one that relates with what Clara was saying, that we cannot continue expecting, what the government is going to give us in a way, because now we don't even know like the type of government that we have, and what are their agendas. And something that I would like to mention is talking about this crisis. It relates pretty much with the relationship that we have with land, the society, our society, how it relates with land, and how private property has been imposed on us, and it is the dominant regime, and we have embraced it. We have allowed it to grow in the ways that Miguel explained, that are completely unsustainable, and where we are not able to live anymore in any place. So something beautiful that I have seen, working with groups, is that people are trying to reclaim, what has been lost, and we have seen, like all what as Miguel was saying, all these properties that are abandoned or empty, not abandoned but empty because they are more profitable that way, or that they are abandoned because of different reasons, or public land that is sitting empty. And so people have been organizing, mostly there are like different currents or ways, but since 2008 that it was kind of like, this is enough, And I want to return a little bit to the beginnings of my own country, that is Mexico. And when we think about one of the largest civilizations in all the America, the continent, is the city of Teotihuacan, that is very close to Mexico City. And the city of Teotihuacan has been considered as the first city providing social housing at large, like citywide. It has been a mystery because when the other civilizations found Teotihuacan, it was already empty. So there was no people, so it was a mystery. And both archaeologists and historians have been trying to decipher, what was the life in Teotihuacan. And they realized that because of the organization, that all the homes were very similar. And, like in other societies, if we see like every city here, so you will see the houses of the millionaires, middle class, the poorest, So over there, the urbanization was pretty equal. And then they discovered that there was a kind of like shared governance, a collective governance, and the way that the housing compounds were organized were in small communities, different homes with a little courtyard, and that they were kind of like helping each other and living in collectivity, and the same compounds were like multiplied, So this tells us a lot because when the conquest happened, so the capitalist system and with the private property was imposed, like in my country and in all the Americas, and it was exactly when that collectivization was completely destroyed, when wealth inequalities emerged, where segregation, discrimination, oppression, and exploitation took place. All those words were not known back then, or were not what it means right now. Something very interesting that we have been reading is that the word equality was not a word in Europe. It didn't exist because there was no equality. So when the Spaniards came to America, there was like a word for that. No, it was somehow translated, and it was that concept was made popular, no, in Europe, but everything was based in the Americas. And they were really shocked of see how like the people live in collectivity, how men and women were the same, how they were living, you know, like in shared properties. So nobody owned anything. And but sadly, our society decided to follow the path of private property under a capitalism regime, right? And all the collective was destroyed, well, most of it. Thankfully, there are like many still towns and cities in Latin America, and I guess also like in places like here, you know, we have First Nations population that is still have those traditions. The Mexican Revolution happened because of that, because they wanted to return to the collectivization of land and housing, and they had some gains through a revolution. And so the ejidos continue to be something, you know, that many people still live in rural areas that way. But then with the North America Free Trade Agreement in 1994, there was, again, like the policies, the law changed in Mexico to give priority or to benefit industries that were coming, you know, to settle like in Mexico to create what are the assembly industries, no? So it was, again, like a massive displacement. Part of the neoliberalism that Miguel was mentioning, many of those rural communities had to move to Mexico City and eventually come north, you know, because they didn't have any other way of living. Interestingly, if you ask me about alternatives, what is happening in New York and in many cities in the United States is try to return to that collectivism and to reclaim the land that has been taken from us. And this has been happening through what we call the community land trust movement. Community land trusts are emerged actually like during the civil rights movement in the South, in Black communities. But the first community land trust that was used in an urban area, one of them, I don't want to say the first, but one of the most famous ones is in New York City. And it was precisely during the time, like after the Second World War, that the city was completely restructured. We had on one hand the suburbanization of the American cities, that people that came from the war had the opportunity to go to the suburbs, buy a house, but all the Latinx communities, the Puerto Rican community and the Black communities stay in inner city neighborhoods that were completely suffering disinvestment, and really falling apart, because the middle class base left the city, and with them, they just abandoned their homes. They stopped paying, like taxes or mortgages. Their homes were taken by the city or by banks. So out of like this situation, what happened is that Black and brown communities are like, okay, if the government is not going to do anything with these homes, we are going to occupy them, and we are going to rehabilitate them, and we are going to stabilize our communities. And it was.
What years was this?
This is in the 60s, 70s. So when it was in the 70s, where like all these movements start like pushing the city to create laws that will allow people, because they were already squatting, so they were not asking permission, but that the city realized, okay, we cannot do anything for those homes. We are going to make an agreement, and some laws were creating that tenants could organize, occupy homes. The city will give them money for the rehabilitation, and at the end, in a period of 5 years, after some training, they were going to give them the title, to these groups, and create cooperatives, housing cooperatives, what we call limited equity cooperatives. So just like in America was kind of like this land taken from like indigenous communities and First Nation communities. In Europe was something very similar, also capitalism, super strong. Rural communities had also collectivized arrangements, no? And mostly, with agriculture, with animals, different businesses, no? Like cooperativism starts as mostly with labor movements, no? In Europe, this was like in the 19th century, no? So it was kind of similar, but again, this was way after, what we are talking about, Teotihuacan and all that. But something interesting is that the influences that happened in New York and here in the United States came from Europe, no? For instance, in the United States, and it was actually like in New York and in Brooklyn, the first housing cooperatives were established in 1916. Thanks to an immigrant communities coming from Finland. So the Finnish communities organized, influenced by utopian socialism, no, that was very strong in Scandinavia, in Germany, in the Netherlands. And they got together, the workers, and they said, like, we cannot continue living, like paying rent, having like horrible housing, without ventilation, without natural light, without restrooms. So they started organizing, and they formed like this first cooperatives in Brooklyn. The first one emerged, the second one next by, and in less than 10 years, there were like 20 plus buildings. I'm talking about buildings of like really large buildings, like half a block. And then this kind of like model spread to other parts of the city, especially the Bronx and Manhattan. And this,
Can you explain to us exactly what the cooperatives is about?
Yeah.
Like, what is the organizational principle and how does it differ from just having a private title to a home?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. So basically it's something very similar to what we can find like in indigenous communities, that the land is shared, the governance is shared, the responsibilities are also shared. That there are like certain principles that are based in solidarity and mutual aid, in care, and that there is no a profit. No, there is because everything is shared. Like everything that is, if there is like if you have like a home and there is equity on that property because it's shared, everyone gains. No, but usually it's reinvested in the maintenance of the building or creating like a school or a community center. So everything is for the benefit of that community, no? So under like very similar principles, this cooperativism and these intentional communities or utopian communities emerged in Europe, were brought here to the United States and proliferated, no? Mostly has endeavors, led by labor movements or by unions. But then in the 50s, going more like closer to our times, there was also a push to establish some laws in the state of New York City. And there was one of the best programs, let's put it that way, successful programs, because they developed many housing units with investment from the state, from the city, and also I think that it was a little bit also like private in a way, but this was for the middle class, no? And then going back to the 70s when I was saying that all these buildings were abandoned, so like all the people that was left behind, because these other cooperatives were mostly for the middle class, were the ones, we're talking about brown and black communities that organized and started occupying these buildings. Yeah. Okay, so all this was to form what we are seeing today, like this movement of we want to reclaim again the land, no, and the buildings and the properties, and well, returning to the principle that I was saying, that it was one organization that start kind of like mobilizing, and they managed to acquire 21 buildings from the city at a certain point, starting from the late 50s, 60s, and 70s. That was like a very long struggle, but they managed at the end to gain 21 buildings, but they were kind of like spread in one neighborhood. So they decided to take this community land trust model that was kind of like more for rural areas to have like separated, just talking about what is a community land trust, so that they could separate what is the land from the buildings. So the owners of the buildings are like one group or different groups, and the owners of the land is another group. So it's like a nonprofit organization that has like board members that are like people for the community or experts or tenants or residents. But what it does is that takes the land from the market. So it decommodifies the land. And it could be that there are like different types of housing or buildings or community centers or schools, but because they are, they have to lease the land to the community land trust, the community land trust never is going to allow that the buildings or the units go at a certain price. So there are like certain rules. No, they have kind of like what is called like bylaws, and they have like disagreements. So this model has been like really popular and has been really desired, no? Like now in places like New York City where it is impossible to own a house. And now I think that I mentioned before, there are like more than 20 organizations and that are working on the establishment of community land trusts across the city, no? Based on this specific community land trust that emerged in the Lower East Side, no? So that is one of the solutions. Of course, there are social housing, rent-stabilized housing, and many others. But this is one solution that is really taking from the root, the problem that is taking the private land, of the market and collectivizing the land and guaranteeing that it's going to be affordable in perpetuity. Because that is the most amazing thing, no? That is something that is not 1 year or 2 years or for one generation, but is thinking about the future generations, and also any investment that the city does, like if folks that are organizing get some fund from the state or from the city, that property is going to be affordable forever. So it's also like a good way to, it's kind of like a sustainable way of developing homes, no? There are also like a lot of complications, and you may have like many questions, but I think that I'm going to stop here. Yeah.
Can I just ask you, what is the name of that land trust?
Cooper Square, yes. The name is Cooper Square. It's based in the Lower East Side.
It was the first example.
It is the first. It is one of the first. There was another one, but it's the first that is active. And we continue. I'm part of the board of directors, so we continue acquiring more buildings and taking them from speculation and from the market. Yeah.
That is extremely interesting, because you see how ultimately the solutions stemming from forces from below can be very imaginative and rethinking the relation with the house itself. Yeah. Seattle just passed a law that is about actually a wealth tax of those who make more than $1 million a year, and they're using that money to actually build proper public housing. But again, this is something that probably came out of a lot of pressure of organizers from below. And once more, I think what is interesting is to think about ways in which you're not once more relying on laws from above, but how do you pressure from laws to laws from above, from below. And I think before opening up, so if you agree, I would just open it up and we can continue. But before we do this, I have the first question. I take advantage of my power as a moderator to ask about what is happening in Mexico, because both you and Miguel are actually advising. You were saying how you advise progressive governments. I know you advised, at least Miguel, the Ecuadorian government, and now you're advising the current government of Claudia Sheinbaum. So I'm wondering, what is that about? Is that also coming out of pressures from below? Or is this more kind of just some enlightened elite who wants to do good for society? What's going on? And in what sense, and I think this is a very interesting point, in what sense is the state in Brazil pushing the limits of what is possible under capitalism, in the sense that, a capitalist system is based on two pillars: the command over investment of private owners and wage labor, right? So these are the two pillars. And ultimately, the point is that social reform can politicize these pillars, in the sense that people may start asking, why are we organizing society according to these pillars? Can't we think outside this box? And what happens is that when you find governments that have the courage, obviously, usually it's because, again, they have pressure from the base to do something that is more than just supporting and subsidizing private investors and de-risking private investors, as we see as the norm, then this risks ultimately opening up spaces for post-capitalist economies in some way. So again, it's a gradualist way of getting to post-capitalist economies, is pushing governments to go beyond what is feasible in terms of the logic of profit. So I'm wondering whether you feel like the current Mexican government is in a path of experimenting with something that is a little bit more courageous than what we usually think about.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, it's an exciting thing for us always to talk about, because, one thing that has started to happen is that, I've been traveling a lot to Mexico. And I should tell you that when I left Mexico, because I'm a Mexican, I never wanted to return, because the society was so polarized, and it still is to a certain extent. But I never actually could have believed that this major turn that started a few years ago. But before I say that, I might forget something I wanted to say. I will add a third pillar to this, which is to the capitalist is the destruction of nature.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Nature.
But which is included in the private command of investment.
Yeah, but it's a very important pillar
Yes.
to integrate into these, because one of the issues that is debated most amongst Marxists today is that the text that Marx never published, that came after volume 1, 2, and 3. And in those texts, there's scholars that are diving super hard in it, that they're finding that the newer text, Marx was going against his own logic of developmentalism, because he saw a thing he called a metabolic rift. So that space in which capital was creating this sort of hole that would lead into an absolute destruction of the planet, which is also one thing that we're feeling. So it's like a trendy thing amongst Marxists, and there's been discussed all over the place. But okay, going back to Mexico. So I would say that as many of you and of us and so on that have crazy dreams, David Harvey and myself had some experiences in Ecuador and so forth, and we saw how interesting was being so close to the presidents and the upper sort of echelons of power, because it was, you talk to them and somehow they listen and something happened, right? It was an immediate, especially, at that time it was Rafael Correa, which seemed as a relatively progressive, at least he called himself like an anti-neoliberal, right, kind of government. And so we saw these a lot. And in our experience with Gabriella, myself, and also David had also worked a lot with us. The previous work that we have been doing was bottom up, right? And we love that. But of course, it has so many limitations, precisely because you can plan together as bottom-up people whatever you want, but if you don't have the laws and policies, regulations, and governmental support, pretty much nothing happens. And this was part of the frustration that we had. And so David and I were talking at some point, and then it all came by because we're talking with Ada Colau, who was the very famous and very, I guess, right now is like the superstar mayor, ex-mayor of Barcelona. She was part of the Plataforma Afectados por la Hipoteca. So it's a movement people affected by mortgages, which was like legendary from the 2008 financial crisis. So she became the mayor under this platform, right, attacking banks. And she was the mayor for 8 years. And we learned that they were hiring consultancies that were McKinsey or PricewaterhouseCoopers or Boston Consulting or, Deloitte and that type of stuff. And it was just like such a contradiction, right? You have like a progressive government that wants to do things, but sadly, because of the neoliberal, I guess, attack of governments don't have any more departments or intelligence sufficient because they're not funded to do some researches. But the only offer really has been McKinsey and all of these consultancy groups. And so David and I said, like, wouldn't it be interesting to occupy that space? If we focus just, advising, supporting, being an open ear to progressive governments around the world. And of course, the biggest problem that we now have is that there aren't too many progressive governments. There are some municipalities, yes, definitely, but as a nation, I'm under the impression right now that Mexico might be the only one right now of a certain sort of position. And so we immediately, of course, wanted to work with Mexico once we knew that Claudia Sheinbaum was going to be the president. And we were very lucky because before we even approached Claudia Sheinbaum, she invited us to Mexico to give a talk with, to have a panel, but also ask us to help the government do rent stabilization policies and that kind of stuff. Because as you can imagine, as in every city in the world, I mean, you go to Mexico City, the prices are insane. It's exactly the same as happening in New York and everywhere. And Airbnb is just like, it's a very touristic part. I mean, disaster, right? And of course, people were being displaced. And there was an attempt of Claudia to say, like, okay, let's look at what kind of rent stabilization policies can we apply from a Mexican perspective. And our relationship began there, right? And the more, the government has been developing, is the more amazed I am. And this is, I guess, what Clara wants to hear, because it's really insane. Like, I'm sitting with the upper, government officials, and they're all talking like serious stuff. I mean, like, anti-speculative stuff, right? How can we also create cooperative laws or laws that actually push forward what Gabriella was talking about, right? I can tell you so many other things. I mean, we're right now experimenting a lot with also what they are now calling social rent, which is a very interesting sort of mechanism. Amongst other things, that they have created a bank that charges zero interest, okay, zero, for those that want to acquire a property and so on. And so there are so many policies that the government right now is putting forward that it seems, for me, it's schizophrenic. Imagine, like, I'm in New York, which is, I mean, one thing that New York has that I like and I dislike, like, heavily, in both ways, is that because everything's so compacted, you see, like, you feel every single thing of the bad that is happening in the world. Right? I mean, it just consumes you, right? No matter where you are, people are discussing, oh, damn, Wall Street is down, but everybody, it's like right now that it has not been a decent week for the economy. So when I'm there, right, I'm more like hearing and listening. And then I go to Mexico, right? And the moment I go there, it's just like, what? Right? And then I'm all happy and positive and all of that, right? And then I return to New York, right? And it's become very schizophrenic. But I guess what Clara wants to, I guess for me to say is that the alternatives are there to construct. See, I mean, one of the things that has happened apart from dispossessing us of our homes and all of that, is that the imagination that we could have has been taken away from us. Literally, the majority of individuals that I know from the United States and from Europe also, they feel that it's over. Like, there's nothing you can do. Yeah. And I always tell people, look, what we have now, it was actually designed in a table like the one I'm sitting right now with Mexico, right? Of some people that decided, okay, let's do this law, let's do this, right? Or like now, like some crazy people tried to put tariffs and then set the world afire, right? I mean, completely. Millions and billions of people, right, suffering for the decision of one or two people, right? And so this is, yes. So this is something that I think is also so super important. It's not only conceiving alternative models of housing, but how many are there to conceive? And why is it that we feel so like, Like it's not happening. So again, the experience for me has been so beautiful of just moving back and forth, because I get that viability. And now Gabriella wants to add on something about the Mexican thing.
I mean, just more directly to what Clara is asking us is that we were invited. We worked like for 2 years in creating like this policy for rent stabilized housing. But we did like a very thorough research because we are obsessed with research, and we had some recommendations. And what we saw is that many people, many communities were already living in collectivity, because that is kind of our legacy. No, many rural folks, like families that have been displaced from rural areas, are living in the city. There have been cooperatives created by indigenous communities that move, to sell, their arts and crafts in the city, creating like amazing organizational forms in the city. And so we propose that. We said like we really need. We start looking at the laws in Mexico, and we realized. I mean, it was something that we all knew, but we never thought about it. That after the Mexican Revolution, that was really about land reform. A new constitution was formed that was one of the most progressive ones in Latin America. It was in 1917, and as part of our constitution was said that it has to be, like a more egalitarian country, and there should be like land reform, and also cooperative societies had to be formed for as a consumer cooperatives, but also for housing. But worker cooperatives develop, in a way, but housing cooperatives never develop as they should, So then our labor has been to take those articles from the Constitution and create the legislation to support cooperative housing, to acknowledge the cooperativism that is already there, like in big cities. But not only that, we arrive in a very important moment, because in 1918 or 17, there was like a new constitution for Mexico City, because it used to be like Washington, D.C.
Okay, 2017.
2017, right before the pandemic. So it was a new constitution where the right to the city, the right to housing, and many other rights were proposed, and passed. But again, the pandemic happened. So like all the progress that was made by many people, a lot of activists and lawyers, stopped in a way. So now when we started working over there, we were like, okay, we really need to think about, how to think about the Mexican Constitution from 1917, the Constitution of Mexico City of 2018-19, and to create that legislation, So which is extremely exciting, because it's creating change, at that level, and proposing programs and initiatives and tools, fiscal tools, financial tools, to make this happen, Because the culture is there, so it's way more easy, when the culture of cooperativism is there than when you are building it from zero, So that is kind of like part of the work that we are doing, and it's amazing to also see what has failed here in New York. That is where we are based. Also, we live like for 8 years in Europe, in the Netherlands, and we practice over there. So we also studied deeply, the social housing and cooperative housing and all of that over there. And we also have like a very interesting insight of what worked and what didn't, So it's not like what I want to say is that it's not we don't need to start from scratch, but there are so many practices, so many influences, and many things that you have it here also. I mean, your state is a very rich state with many of those type of cultures. So it's when we went to Mexico, like we have all this knowledge about Europe and New York and the United States, but we want to create something endogenous, to really work with the people and do something that works for the people with the experience that we have. And I think that is very important. And everything starts from groups like here, to having like these imaginaries, these ideas coming together and then push for those laws, no, and those movements.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. A round of applause for our speakers. So we have time for a discussion that is more collective and open. Speaking of alternatives on the ground, I would like to call Bryce up if he wants to maybe ask the first question and tell us a little bit about the Tulsa in Oklahoma Tenants Union and how it's organizing here on the ground. They also have a table out there. So some local expertise, and also if you want to open the question. And then what I would do is have 3 questions, let some time to answer, 3 questions, let some time to answer, if that works. And then there's food upstairs that is waiting for us.
Thank you, Clara. I don't know about expertise, but I'm Bryce. I'm with Oklahoma Tenants Union. We are a group here with a Tulsa local that we're building up, but also in OKC and surrounding areas that focuses on building direct action committees in the places where people live so that we can act in solidarity and challenge landlords in a more collective way together rather than in, say, eviction courts where you're alone and you're kind of at the mercy of the judge at that point. So the question I wanted to ask was, as a tenants union, we see our organization as intending to build collective power beyond just renters, but also among the unhoused, the institutionalized, and other groups of people without control of their housing. And in that light, we've had a little bit of trouble getting sort of a sense of the specific interests of these different groups of tenants. Like, for example, how does housing development relate to the unhoused versus lease renters? And so my question was, are some of these interests for renters different from those of other groups within the broader tenant class? And in that line, what do you all make of those differences of material interest, and how do we bridge such divides to form a cohesive movement for housing for all? Thank you.
Great. So whoever would like to ask a question can stand right there. All right, perfect. There's already a line. Perfect, come on up. And it would be great, yes, if you can introduce yourself and kind of, say a couple words of who you are and then ask a question.
Okay. Hi, my name is Dylan O'Carroll. I'm a counselor in Tulsa. A lot of my clients are they live on the streets. I am unfortunately a part of the. I guess I now am learning about the new gentrifiers, but I have access to people, and I can tell them things. So a lot of the folks who are homeless, who live on the streets, many of them get Social Security. I'm wondering, are there any sort of ways to leverage fixed income to help folks? Because a lot of them are elderly, they're disabled, right? That's the way you qualify for Social Security. It's a wonderful idea. Are there ways to leverage fixed income, creative ways to leverage their collective power to obtain housing?
Thank you.
Hello, I am Ragsu Rita Ragland. I use you, your, or they, them pronouns. I'm a local trans woman, and I express myself as gender fluid and non-binary. In my day job, I am a behavioral health case manager and a peer recovery support specialist. I work mostly with transgender and gender non-conforming clients, and they are disproportionately impacted by being forcefully unhoused. In my off-duty hours, I volunteer by organizing local gift economies and doing outreach to forcefully unhoused neighbors. My question revolves around an experience I had a couple years ago while interacting with some colleagues doing some outreach. We were handing out some water during some heat waves, and I was engaging with some people that were doing outreach from, I believe, John 3:16. It was one of the religiously based shelters. And I was trying to start a conversation to collaborate with them. I wanted to get a list of the aid they were providing so that we could offer different aid to fill gaps that might meet more needs. And whenever I expressed that to him, he point blank told me, no, we don't want to meet everybody's needs because then they might want to be homeless. And I was absolutely floored by this expression. But also in the 2 years since this interaction, I also live in Sapulpa, which is a suburb of here. And I have heard that expression from people doing outreach in suburbs outside of the metropolitan area. And I think it's a larger cultural issue. And I just want to know if we can talk about it, because it's my understanding that we need to meet people's needs in order to get them to a place where we can get them housing. And we need to meet their needs in order to make them feel as part of the community. We should be meeting their need of housing, but currently we don't have that power. But I just think we should talk about the culture and how far away we are from even having a conversation that they need housing. We're just having a conversation of understanding that we need to meet basic needs. Thank you.
To begin addressing.
I'm sort of put on the spot here. Listen, I think each of those questions had some valid points to bring up. And I'll start with the last questioner. I think outreach is not an easy task. You're building relationships and trust, and that takes time. You're not going to step onto somebody who's been, and one thing I want to, folks, I don't want to get into a tit for tat around homelessness and houseless. I understand people use both of those. I use homeless, but I understand both. So please don't be offended by something I say. I get it. But I think a person who is living on the street needs trust from somebody, and there's a reason why they're out there. And that trust takes time. You're not going to be able, especially, I've always found it difficult with outreach working with religious communities. They have their own agendas, which is a little bit different than the agenda that you and I might have. We might go, or they'll claim to be under the humanitarian umbrella, but they're a humanitarian if you read this, if you absorb this. I think that's I don't believe that's a carrot. I believe that's a stick. So I think you have to go with your own gut feeling, and you're not going to get along with everybody. You're not going to be able to form a partnership with everybody, but understand that and continue with the task at hand. If you in your heart feel you're doing what's right, then continue to do it that way, because I think it's going to garner results, right? I've often said to folks in New York doing, our city also, part of that $3 billion that I talked about is contracting for street outreach. People who don't have the experience. So I've often asked to ride shotgun with some of those folks because I speak a little bit of a different language than that outreach worker does, right? And I realized that years ago when I was in Hungary and speaking to some people who were sleeping along a canal. And the Hungarians were trying to talk to them. They pushed back. But when I was saying through a translator they said, well, there's something in this guy knows the life that we live. So you can get through a person through communication, but it's all about trust and spending a lot of time. So I would just encourage you to continue to go down the road you're going. You seem like you're doing it from a humanitarian base, and that's always important. With respect to the person who talked about fixed incomes, every city is different in the country. We do have an infrastructure in New York where folks on fixed income can get access to housing. So in addition to the availability, which is lessened now based on the current administration, Section 8 vouchers was a way for a long time in New York, but New York City has its own voucher system called the City FEPS, which also works with fixed and low income people to allow them, and it works on the same basis as the Section 8 voucher. So it's having that infrastructure, right? As much as I criticize not-for-profit organizations, there is a small subsection of our not-for-profit groups that does this work to see that seniors on fixed income have access to decent and affordable housing. Not an easy task, and some of those Social Security payments are low, so it's still a struggle, but we've been able to work through that for the most part. And with respect to tenant organizing, what was his name? Bryce. So tenant organizing is not an easy task, and especially when you try to bring different sections of the community together, right? There are those Earlier on, I mentioned how much are we complicit in our own problems. So a single-family homeowner will say to you, I don't care about those people. I worked hard to get mine. You go get yours, right? Do what I did. But I think there have been successes around the country where folks have done what I like to refer to as a popular and political education, bringing those folks into a space and having conversations. And, we tend to say here, you got to meet people where they're at. I'm not so sure if I believe in that statement. I don't say it's wrong, but I use a formulation that I've inherited from Brazil. They do something called formação, political formation. Let's bring people to a political place through formation, and then we move together because we're all aligned when we start to move and do the work, right? So we're at a different level. So there's different ways to look at it. Bryce, I'd like to see you after this. There is a group, a dynamite tenants organizer in Indianapolis, Indiana, who's closer to you than I would be in New York. There are some great ones in New York, but D Willis is in Indianapolis, and he started a dynamite tenant organizing group there and is getting recognized around the country for the work that he's doing. So I'm sure that I can connect you two to have some conversations. He's also part of the National Low Income Housing Coalition.
Very nice. What do you want to add something to the three questions? Or?
The organizing. And when I arrived to New York City, that was like 15 years ago, there was like a lot of fragmentation, and it continues to be, but in a different way. But something that was really powerful that I saw is a creation of coalitions at the neighborhood level, at the borough level, and at the city level, and at the state level. There is a coalition that is called Housing Justice for All, that probably, you know it. And they are organizing tenants and homeowners and homeless folks. So it's very huge, very inclusive. And they won just before the pandemic the greatest, there was like the greatest win in a generation in terms of tenant rights. So something completely unseen, thanks to this coalition of organizations. And also with the community land trust movement, now we are seeing like a coalition with all these different groups pushing together, like with some have similar needs, similar focus. Some are like looking at land in a different way, some others on buildings. But we are all together working towards the Community Land Act, that is like a set of bills. And all this work has been done because we are working together. It is not easy, that it has its conflicts and complexities, but I will encourage you to look at them. Yeah.
Should we go other round? And then you...
I'll do the other round. Start with the other round.
I'm totally related with everything that you have said so far, because happened to be that we live in Florida for 20 years. We passed all those hurricanes together, Jane, Wilma, Katrina. And we see Florida disappear on those years that we were living in Florida. The community totally different. It stopped growing. We saw the boom of foreclosures all falling apart. And there were no business. There were nothing to do. I guess I have a little part-time job by then. My daughter was little by then. My husband lost his job when the market crashed and all these foreclosures happened. We were almost to living down a bridge. Our community church just helped us out, build it up. We decided to go to school. We went for art. Basically, my husband is a journalist and a writer, and I am a graphic designer, and neither one are working in our fields. We ended up working as administration in medical fields. So nothing wrong with it. We love it. We love what we do. We love what we are. Well, now we are stepping in a year that we have been working so long for so many hours, and we're not reaching out. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So that was our adventure in Florida. We have an opportunity to come into Tulsa, and here we are. So in Mexico, I had the fortune to visit Mexico. I do have family in Mexico. I have friends and family in Mexico. And one of the things that it shocked me was to see so large population. And I guess the earthquake just happened like a year before when we arrived over there, and there were people homeless in the streets. And there was these huge buildings around Mexico City, empty, with no one. And I could see on the hotel that I used to be, I can see engineers going up and down, checking on the buildings. And I believe that they were like looking for that infrastructure, checking into the infrastructure. I guess they were trying to either shut it down or building it up. I was also, my husband knows Correa personally. We were not really fans of him, but we saw the growth of Ecuador going into being people that were domestic. They were a different class. And they were not able to afford a house or a land or car or cell phones, nothing of that. And I could see in the years that the years that Korea was in, they raised up. They were able to afford a home. They were able to afford a car. They were able to make a transportation and develop the land that was far behind. I'm not saying it's great, but I can make the difference of what was that community that left in Ecuador than the one that I see it now. And even though my friends will complain or whatever they want to complain, but they don't realize they want to see, and they come to America thinking that we want that American life, but in here, and it doesn't make what the room is about. In Ecuador, my family.
I'm sorry, if you can just ask the question,
I'm going to
because
the
there's
question.
many
So
people in
my family does own a home, and one of the issues that all these countries has, and it's that what I developed, is the legal part. What is the legal part that it tells you that you always have conflict, that this will be your land, that this will be your home, and that is going to make a community out of that? What is the part? Because that's the problem that Ecuador has. They have the land, they have the issue, they have community lands all together, but the back of the legality of it doesn't approach it. And when the earthquakes come by, doesn't happen. And it gets stuck. So that's my question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Introduce yourself if you can.
Hi, I'm Wolf Hertzberg. Thank you all for this really interesting conversation. So one of the striking ideological developments of my conscious life has been the rise of left YIMBYism. And there are a lot of people now in the Democratic Party, people who identify as being on the left, but who are very concerned with increasing the housing supply. What they say is increasing the housing supply by making it easier to build, including private developers. Now, several of you, maybe all of you in different ways, have alluded to the idea that housing shortage is a supply problem, or rather that affordability is a supply problem, and said that it's not that. You've criticized that idea. So I wonder if you wanted to take the opportunity to directly, if you're going to rebut the left YIMBYist, why is it not? Because I think there is a housing shortage. I mean, that seems like a fact. You guys are all New Yorkers, as am I. And in New York, we do have a housing shortage, among many other things. So if that's not the cause of affordability, why is it not?
Thank you. Come over.
Hello, my name is Garrett. My job title is Housing Navigator, which really just means I bribe landlords, I think, and help people sign up for existing things. But what I was going to ask about was kind of pinpointing, maybe in layman terms, what decommodifying looks like. Like sometimes we drive in nice neighborhoods and I'm like jealous and mad at these nice houses. And I just want folks to say, I need a house, can I get a free one? And I guess maybe my American mind conveys it to like, you know, if a lawyer, if you don't have the means to have your own, the state provides. So is decommodifying like something the state owns and like we collectively paid for it, or like, I don't know, the transformation of like how you make something communal when we're so individualistic. And that kind of bleeds into the idea of like the self-interest at housing, not only just in thinking my home will generate wealth, but like, oh, I want a house in a good school district because the taxes pay for schools, or I want this and X and Y. And like maybe how we communicate to folks who are understandably trying to survive a certain system, but maybe how like we are kind of complicit in the problems, because it's hard not to be when you really feel responsibility to your family or future kids or whoever. So
Thank you so much. Just to, for knowledge, how many questions do we still have? How many people want to ask questions? 2. So should we get them to, and then so we do the last round and then we close? Does that work? Okay, ask them now and then you can all pick.
Andrew Wood, historian and drifter. First of all, just want to say thank you to you all for your work. And Rob, your story is, I'm sure you've heard this a lot of times, but very moving and encouraging. And Miguel, I like what both you and Gabriella say about going and interacting with people in Mexico and how that is uplifting. I find that to be true, given my limited experience as well. Speaking of Mexico and speaking of history, there is a long history, a colorful one, of tenant organizing. I wrote a book on the tenant strikes in the 1920s in Veracruz, but there were also strikes, not altogether coordinated, but happening simultaneously in the capital, in Guadalajara, of course. There were reform laws in Yucatan initially, and then, of course, in Veracruz under a sympathetic, progressive governor. My question, and also I wanted to add that I got a chance to meet people in Boyle Heights in working class Los Angeles about 2 years ago, and they are fiercely trying to defend their neighborhood in every sort of way and fighting against this fierce monster, which we call gentrification. Jeremiah Moss wrote a really great book, Vanishing New York, about gentrification, and goes neighborhood by neighborhood and talks to people specifically, not just in terms of housing, but mechanic shops, and I'm sure you're familiar with his work. But given all of the fascism that we're facing, and the power, and the financiers, and the sympathetic mayors like Bloomberg and Giuliani and so many others, I am discouraged. I am worried about the growing number of people who will be houseless, like here in our town. And I'm somewhat at a loss for strategies. Back in the day, people would strike. People would not pay their rent and more. But it seems like a lot of people just want to drive their car and go in their back door and stay in their houses. So my question is, strategies, in addition to the great work that you're doing, what can we ordinary people do in cities that are not the richest in the world, and so on? Thank you.
Jaime Rodriguez, Tulsa, came from California. Just kind of thinking about all this housing thing and how, Tulsa's housing development has been going on for years now. My dad works in construction. Mainly, he's a contractor to build a bunch of like the suburban neighborhood houses that continue like across it. And having been, involved in that, seeing how he does things, I always find it kind of personally like a little frustrating how inefficient the whole process is, because of course it's a profit motive to do all of that. Many people who are contracting have the means and the wealth to produce these personalized houses in neighborhoods, in suburban neighborhoods. And so my question is kind of two-part. The first part is what neighborhood model have you found to be maybe your personal favorites among each of you? And the second part is, how much does transportation and the means and access to transportation influence housing as like, a whole neighborhood and community?
Wonderful. We have a lot of questions.
Thank you for the questions. I mean, I wish we could stay longer and longer and you were not hungry so that we could stay. No, but we can talk over there, of course. If I don't manage to answer any, clearly I won't, but I will try. I think the first issue that I want to take on is the question of gentrification. I sometimes make a parallel of the word gentrification to the word Anthropocene. Okay?
The word, sorry?
Anthropocene. The Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is that, perhaps you've heard that word, which is some scientist, actually a Nobel Prize laureate, decided to call in the 70s an age in which it is very noticeable that humans are the ones that are changing the planet. So it's not like a geological or natural process, but the word is being thrown out heavily in a lot of environmental discourses. Same as gentrification is being thrown out very heavily. My view on the Anthropocene is the following, and this will be the same with gentrification. These are words that function more to repress us than to liberate us. And let me be clear why I say this. It puts the blame on people, like the gentleman that said, like, I'm one of the gentrifiers. I know you around. It's terrible to feel that way, right? I mean, you just want a house, right? But these words, and the same with the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is putting the blame on us, on me, like we're not recycling enough, humans are doing this and so forth. And the reality is that, I know this will sound like, okay, yeah, Miguel, like it's more of a problem of the social system, the relationships that we have, which is basically capital. And it is, being a gentrifier is, I guess, blaming one person. Poor artists. Artists also want a place to live. I know many artists, a lot, and they struggle every day. And if they manage to find a cheaper place where they need a space because they need to create sculptures and all of that, and then everybody's attacking. There's many books, that attack the artists, and all these kind of hipsters, whatever you want to call, all these people. You see how terrible it is? That it's separating our society completely and blaming on people that literally have almost nothing to do with this process. Yeah. And that would be the same with the Anthropocene. Some of us like to call it the Capitalism, which would be very different, and blaming more on extractivist economies, of course, on other issues, right, that are the ones that actually, have created the moment in which we are in the planetary extinction. So I would be very careful with that word gentrification in a way that you try not to use it, right? Because I think it's a very bad word for societal thinking. Now, this is where I want to lead to the many issues that happen today with a lot of movements that are working on housing and on other things. And I think Gabriella and Rob really well alluded to this. Beast, a monster that we face, amongst many other things, is that in our times, we're hyper-fragmented. And it's so painful, right? It's really so painful to see this, right? For example, I have a colleague that is also a very good social activist, a friend, that doesn't want to go to specific meetings because that other housing activist is going to be there, and that other housing activist is not radical enough, right? And we can hear these stories, right? Or it doesn't touch environmental stuff. Oh no, it doesn't talk about gender stuff, so we do these. And I add to the parts of the word gentrification, we have been using these lexicons and these, we'll be preoccupied for individual things like I'm environmentalist, I'm gender rights, I'm like this, but I'm not that, or vice versa. And what this has created is almost an impossible situation where you can unite movements. And I'm talking more specifically about the United States, because in the Mexican situation is very different, no? And in the Brazilian and in Italian and the Netherlands and so forth. And so one, I think the most important thing, and it's like, what should we do? Like common individuals, I'm also a common individual. I just like this thing and I can talk about this, I guess, but is first, like wake up the next day or today after we have drinks and perhaps some of you hangover, I don't know, fight against the fragmentation and the utilization of a language that accuses us for being the culprit. That is the root of a lot of the reasons why neo-fascism has emerged.
Yeah.
It's very easy to blame the other that doesn't think like you. Whereas all of us want the very same thing. We just want a decent form of living, right? We want a good life, as Correa would at some point would say, the president of Ecuador. We just want a good life. And yes, there has to be different modes of thinking in it. I mean, come on, do you think how boring it would be that I'm in a city where everybody's a Marxist? I mean, like, I would just die. I mean, like, imagine the boring where you're discussing like chapter by chapter and whether you interpret it right or you're wrong, because this is what we do, right? Imagine that, right? So this is, I think, part of the core of what somebody also addressed to as a cultural change. If our minds don't do that or don't attempt to do a cultural shift, and it's very difficult. It takes an everyday, effort to do this. We're not going to achieve anything. I mean, if we don't realize that the only way to fight the current things is to unite, rather than fragment, which is again what we continue doing, it's insane. I mean, like, I think deep in you wouldn't believe that that's even possible, right? It requires all of us just to believe that we can come together. And I think that has been the effort. I mean, Rob, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, like you said it really well. It's like when we're talking about the tenant rights, right? It's not about your tenant rights, which is fantastic, right? Great. But the question is, how can you unite, exactly what you're saying, begin to network with other the tenant rights, but also with environmental rights people, also with gender rights people, also with, food, rights, or whatever it is that is necessary, because we all have two goals. One is to destroy the systems that are oppressing us, and the other one is just to have a good life, right? And that I wouldn't stop in the United States, but there are tenant rights that are amazing all over the world. And we all can learn from all of them. And they're like totally thirsty for uniting their movements with other movements and so forth, right? So to answer many of these questions that are asked, like what we should do, I know you would say like, well, let's squat a house. I wouldn't recommend to do this now. I mean, it would be great, no? But it seems that, it's been moving into a very oppressive military kind of situation. I don't want you getting hurt. You're very much more useful out of jail or out of I don't know what compound in Guantanamo, that they decide to put us on, than, all of us have to be much more intelligent than this. And I think the intelligence today is related to two things. One that I said, forcing yourselves to imagine that other worlds are possible because they have been possible, right? I mean, like everything Gabriella was mentioning, right? All the indigenous groups, all the Native Americans that surround you have other visions that are very, very, I think, amazing in so many ways. Of course, we can criticize it, but they have the casinos. I mean, we all have to find ways of living, right? So that is, I think, is the two kind of situations that I would respond to. And I know I'm taking a lot of time on these, but I need to address the Jimby thing. Who was the Jimby question? The socialist Jimby? Yes. Okay. Many of us that work on the realms of, I guess, anti-capitalist discourse, right? Let's not call it Marxism because it's in general, we believe that capitalism is death. It's destroying us and the planet and everything. We don't like to see ways of addressing problems by creating more problems or by adding into the machinery of production of capital. So the building of new homes accelerates that machinery more. Our focus, in many ways, is about the redistribution of what's existing.
Sorry,
Right?
Miguel, you're answering the question about why it's the rhetoric, it's all a supply side problem is problematic, right?
Well, about the YIMBY, I'm not sure if I explained the YIMBY, but there are groups that form in the Yes in My Backyard that they want to be development happen because there's a lot of people that don't want development. Those are called the NIMBY, not in my backyard. And so, yes, there is a housing shortage, right? But if we continue to add more housing that has a high probability of just being a speculative asset, no? And don't address the current issue, which is how to redistribute the already existing wealth and richness that exists there, meaning empty homes, empty lots, and well, we can go on and about the different things. So it's not that I have a beef around this. I think it's very important that we build new forms of housing, but be very aware that sometimes this just adds more into this sort of systemic condition. Yeah. And sadly, yes, I think a lot of socialist Democrats, or at least that side of the DSA, that are in the YIMBY, have not, I guess, addressed this situation. So you could be one of the first ones, right, that go into it. I think the role of YIMBY should be what to do with what already exists and how to redistribute it. A lot of people believe that there's enough food in the world for everyone. Everyone. There's enough housing, land for everyone, right? And that, I think, is just so much of a deeper form of addressing these than just supplying what the market wants. Yes.
That's why studying the logic of capital is very helpful in not ending up in these traps that ultimately just escalate the same problem.
Yeah.
Last words to Gabriella and then Rob.
I just want to say thank you to the person that mentioned about the rent strikes in Veracruz, Mexico, and in other parts of Mexico and also in Los Angeles. We know about those mobilizations and something very interesting about the Chicano movement in LA, in Boyle Heights, is that it is the largest tenant union in the nation, so it is huge. What are you? I'm trying to, I want to read your book. I know Leo Vilchis. I don't know if you know him, but he's one of the leaders, and they just published a book with a comrade that is called Abolish Rent. Really, really good book, a small book, but really powerful. So I recommend you all to buy it. We didn't mention about the tenant unions, but they are also very strong in New York City. Miguel also has conceptualized, we started conceptualizing this 20 years ago about the urban unions. That is more about not just like a tenant union, but unions with different groups of people, very similar to a labor union, but a neighborhood union. And those are models that we can imagine, So very powerful comment, so thank you. I just wanted to say that.
So 2 quick follow-up points around the tenants union. I want to lift up tenant unions organizing in New York City to get the right to counsel law passed. Right to counsel was a law that was passed in 2017 that says you have the right to legal counsel in eviction court. In New York City, eviction court is a civil court action, and we had statistical data that showed us for years, 99% of the people that went into housing court without a legal representative lost the case. But that number is down to less than 20% today. I think the other thing, you asked about new strategies around homelessness. I think we need to get people to talk about what they're going through. We've shamed people into submission in this country. They're shamed by it, they don't talk about it. But I'm a big believer in data. Data can be used for you or against you, and the people in power understand data. So when you start to collect these stories of people that went through similar things that I went through, then you have some data to say, this is a societal issue. It's not the individual issue that you make it up to be. So the more that we can collect those stories and make those stories public, through whether it be through storytelling projects like Gabriella and I are both involved in, Picture the Homeless, the organization that I started with, is on the Housing Justice Lab website. It's one of the first projects, but it's a very powerful people sharing their stories around, not only around what they went through, but how they lifted themselves up and fought back against the system. So I think it's a way of collecting data that we don't traditionally think. Many of our communities think data collection is surveillance. I don't. I like data collection because I know I can use data for my story to push back in a way that's going to work when we try to do some advocacy work. So thank you.
Something related with that. As Clara mentioned, we have what is called the Housing Justice Oral History Project. So if you Google it, you will find it. That is collective oral history projects of struggles and fights, and with different groups of housing, that are facing different things. And I really encourage you to do this type of projects in your communities because, as Miguel said and also said, the history is very important, and you need to also honor all of those that came before you, that were in your neighborhood, in your community, because you cannot start building from zero. There are so many things to learn from the past to shape the future. So just as a project, just learning from each other is super important because knowledge is power, no? So what have been the struggles in the neighborhood? What have been the strategies for organizing? What was successful? Why we failed in this case? How to form those coalitions? So that is super important.
I'd like to say two things. One is that, again, I would like to say that we are also meeting more informally and more often to build this worker community center. So if you want to lead your contact and also I think we're going to have just discussion groups about the topic so as to make it something that's not just the event and nothing that happens after that, but to actually use the event as an accelerator to give us enthusiasm to continue these conversations more in depth. And there's a lot of people helping us out. So I would like to really thank everyone who has helped in this project. It was definitely not me alone. We have so many here that are really helping this build. This is a collective project and I hope it will continue as such. Thank you so much. And the food is on the second floor.